Hi guys. So GDC was 3 weeks ago, and I was so excited by all of the talks and presentations and just cool people there that when I got back home I hopped right into making a bunch of work based off of stuff that I saw there. So here we are in Unity, and I'm going to show you the first thing that I've been working on. I'm going to make a cube. Cool. So the first thing that I did was make a script. And this is basically just a noise script. It applies an offset to the position of this cube based off of a Perlin noise function and the current time. And I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff that you can do with that. Oop, sorry, it's parented to the world. I need to parent it to a game object at that position. Empty cube. No, different cube. Yeah, that cube. Game object, cool. Okay, now when I play, it'll hover right there. So right now, there's no, let's ignore that. So there's no animations actually on this object at the moment. It's being moved around exclusively by a Perlin noise function. And I did some stuff I'm relatively proud of on this. So here you can see some of the arguments. Let me make this the one that you can see. So you can see some of the arguments that it takes. You can feed it a seed value, which seeds the noise function that it'll take in. You can adjust the frequency that it will use to iterate through the noise function. You can also feed into the number of octaves that it receives, which will result in choppier movement. So if I hop this up to 3, you can see that it wiggles around more, and it'll take higher octaves up to 8, where it becomes quite jittery. And this is more obvious in the rotation version of this. But aside from that, you can, let me pop this back down to 1, you can control the amplitude by way of this global amplitude variable, which will let it move around bigger. Or if you want it to move around in one dimension more than the others, you can increase that specific dimension. So now its Y dimension is scaled to be 37 times more intense than any of the others, and now it's back to 1. One of the other fun things is you can offset through time. So if I move this slowly back through time, I can more or less freeze it in place if I can keep pace with time moving forward. This doesn't seem like it would be immediately useful, but I'll show you a use case in a moment. And also you can set a specific seed. If they're all exactly the same, it will move equally in all dimensions, which means it'll move along this this y-axis-y sort of line. But that's not a very interesting motion, so it's usually better to have a bunch of disparate values for all of these, and then it'll move around nicely. Though it does take arguments into the many thousands in here, just so that if you have a lot of noise operated objects in the world, that they tend not to be the same. So one of the cool other things it can do, let me make another game object, another cube, cool. Why does it keep putting them all the way over there? So one of the other cool things is you can feed, instead of just a time value to iterate through the noise function, let me turn the frequency to 0 so that it's not using time at all. Instead, I'm going to make it use the position of another object, and I'll just grab this cube. There we go. So now it'll use the motion of this object to iterate through its noise function. This is really mostly useful if you want something to say these, imagine these were attached to each other, and this guy will be invisible. And you know what, let's actually just attach them. Let me take the game object and stick it. Oop, cube turned invisible. Let me actually just turn off its mesh renderer, that way it's still in the scene. throw it on that. Okay, so now I have my invisible cube right here, and it will tow along this little noisy buddy it has. So let me turn up the pose frequency to, say, 2. So as you move along, it wiggles. That may not seem super useful, but I promise that it is. So I have a second version of this, which instead of offsetting the position, offsets the rotation. So you can see here, it randomly rotating, and it takes a lot of the same arguments as the original version. But in this case, it doesn't need to look at another object to get a position offset. Oops, still have to move its parent, because it doesn't throw off its own position by virtue of having the noise function on it. So, let me stop it and play it again, and I can even throw out this thing now. So, we have other cool stuff to look at. So here's some test examples. So this little creature looking thing here is moving using this noise function. You can see that it's using turbulent position, but its children circles behind it are also using the same turbulent position using the same seeds, but they have time values that are slightly later in the function, so they trail behind it. So that's pretty useful. And then on the tail end, this last one is emitting particles. And those particles have a randomized position for the emitter and a randomized rotation, and both of those are being affected by the velocity of the parent. So that means that it can kind of fake some vorticity turbulence behind it. So if I go into it and turn up the pose frequency on the random rotation, you can see that it becomes more sensitive to its parent objects moving around faster, and so that'll cause it to whip around and have a more turbulent stream behind it. Yeah. And so it'll just emit particles. They actually aren't receiving a time input, as I recall. I think I turned that off. Yeah, both their frequencies are at 0. So all of this motion is completely based on the motion of its parent. So you can imagine if you had, say, a magic spell that needed to travel at an inconsistent speed, but you wanted it to always draw these kinds of spirals behind it. This is the sort of thing that you'd want, or if you had a fairy character, and no matter what the speed it's moving at, it'll always draw curves with this kind of amplitude, because these amplitudes are based off of the speed at which it's going. So anyway, that's fun. Another cool thing, based off of a similar idea, is this little inflatable wiggly man. So you can see as let me open up all these. As I move through these game objects, each one down the line has a slightly later time offset. You can see this one's 0, this one's negative 0.25, negative 0.5, negative 0.75, and that continues all the way down the arms too. And they're all parented together, unlike the skyfish, which is that little circle creature thing. Since they're all parented together, they inherit the transforms all the way down the chain, so you get these long waving whip-like motions, which is pretty fun. And he has a similar particle emitter on him that causes his hands to shoot out little fun sparkler bits. Anyway, this isn't actually very much like the technique that inspired it. This is all inspired by some Infamous Second Son presentations that were at GDC, and those made a really strong case for using noise in emitting particles. But turns out that is slightly harder than I thought it would be. And actually, I can show you the thing that revealed to me why that is so much harder. So this is mostly just so that I could wrap my head around using noise to do visual effects in Engine, and it's relatively cheap. It's not an expensive sort of effect. But over here, I was trying to wrap my head around manipulating particle systems, and so I followed a really good tutorial by Cat-like Coding that shows you how to emit particles by code and then manipulate their positions. So each of these two functions each of these two particle systems is graphing one of several functions. So let me turn up the resolution on this. So right now it's doing sine of whatever the current time value is, but I mean, you can feed it x equals y or x squared equals y. More interesting work. Oh, and it receives its color based off of the x and y and z offset from the parent position. Anyway, so this one, let me turn up the resolution on this so it's nice and smooth. This one likewise graphs a variety of functions. It'll graph a linear function, or an exponential function, or it'll graph sine time, though this is using sine along both of the x and z inputs, so it's on a fun angle like that. Also, just for good measure, I fed in the same Perlin noise function that is moving around the other stuff into this to make sort of a rippling effect. And speaking of ripples, there's also this other ripple effect. Anyway, so that's all very nice, but it revealed to me that unfortunately the stuff that I wanted to do using noise to manipulate the positions of already emitted particles, it turns out that's relatively in depth. It's impossible the way that I wanted to do it, and if I did want to do it, I would have to emit the particles by code, which would sort of mitigate any advantage to using the shuriken particle system in the first place. So that's kind of a bummer. But I'm still really glad that I did this project, and I'd recommend anyone listening to this who sees this as vaguely interesting to go do it, because I better understand how the particles are emitted and then manipulated, even if it didn't get me exactly the result that I wanted. Though I still think this is a relatively neat effect, even if it's only useful for these sort of trail effects. I think that's not I don't think that's a very, very slim use case. I've used it a couple times since. So then I worked on making a leaning character setup based on some of the work that David Rosen of Wolfire Games showed at the animation bootcamp. And I also took this as an opportunity to dig back into the Mechanim animation system, and that was inspired by a presentation given by Adam Ormsby and Ashley Egan, who run Mech Warriors. So the basic idea is to have a script that makes a character lean based off of their acceleration, so that they keep their center of gravity over their feet and maintain their balance. So I threw together a simple character in Maya and made some basic animations. So here's an idle, and a walk, and a run, and a sort of rolling animation, and I'll get into that in a bit. But the main parts that we care about now are the idle, the walk, and the run, because these are the animations that I'll be managing using Mechanim, and these will be the ones that require leaning to adjust to compensate for the acceleration. Anyway, and it's a relatively simple rig. I think there are like maybe 20 bones in this. Certainly not very many. Anyway, so I threw together these basic animations. I wasn't quite ready to go into the keyframe only workflow that David Rosen showed off, but maybe I'll probably get into that in one of my next projects. Playing around with smooth damp has been a lot of fun recently, and I'd like to try out some of the different interpolation methods that he mentioned. So here is the script that operates. Most of the beginning part here is just wrangling input and calculating your velocity and previous acceleration, and then dampening it or lerping it or whatever is appropriate to get a decently smooth input. But down here is the meat of the calculations for the leaning, and it's the main point of this script. So the lean is handled fairly simply. I store the previous position and use that to get my velocity, and I store my previous velocity and use that to get my current acceleration. I then get the cross product of my acceleration vector and the gravity vector to get my lean axis. So here you can see me getting the target lean axis out of the cross product of vector3.up, which is the gravity vector, and the normalized acceleration vector. So then I use the arctangent of my acceleration and my gravity in degrees, and I use that to rotate around my lean axis. So I'm actually using a lerp to smooth that out, but here you can see I'm getting the arctangent of my acceleration divided by my gravity acceleration, and I'm getting that in degrees, and so I'm using that to move between those values, and that's mediated by a time and a smoothing value. So back in Unity you can see the product of some of this work. So I have this little character, and she leans into whatever direction she's going, and you can see her anim tree updating over here as the speed value is changing, and she just moves between an idle pose and then a series of different walk animations that play at different speeds to accommodate her moving at different sorts of speeds. If I turn up the move speed, or rather the move smooth quite a bit, you can see her go through each of these different levels of movement. It's not as smooth as I want this to eventually be, because she's really only moving between two different animations, but I feel like I'm getting a lot of extra information from this added lean that really helps kind of sell the intent of the character. So anyway, let me pop this back down to a more reasonable 10 and run around for a bit some more. I think I mentioned before that I needed to use a series of lerps and smooth damps to clean up the velocity and acceleration values, and you can sort of see that here, that if I pop the move smooth down to 0, she will very quickly change direction, and at least in WASD this happens too quickly, and it makes for a lot of janky skating animation. So even just having this at a value of 10 evens it out quite a bit, and it does introduce a lot of input lag. And finally, I tacked on that little throw animation to the character so she can throw around bombs. So if I go over here and click, she'll chuck out a little bomb. Fun, huh? So the way the bombs are set up is I just have one of these emitters emitting particles in a semi-random direction controlled by a noise function, and the the bomb actually spawns with a randomized rotation. And I find that draws relatively decent little spirals through the air and gives some character to the motion. Especially if you're moving around and you just kind of chuck one and move again. You get to see some nice spirals through the air. Anyway, and then the explosion effect, when it comes in, does a downward raycast to check how far it is from the ground, and it spawns a different shockwave effect based on the distance between the epicenter of the explosion and the ground. So if I take, where's that? Effect systems, black powder. Yeah, here it is. So let me make it fly higher in the air. That should be enough. Ooh, not quite. Maybe? Nope, totally is hitting the ground. I know, I can just shorten its lifetime. So, oops, get up there. Not quite high enough. So if I throw it nice and high, you can see it'll explode in the air, and actually it's probably easiest to see down here now. If I throw it nice and high, it'll explode in the air a long distance from the ground, so it doesn't kick up any shrapnel, as opposed to if I threw it right along the ground. You can see it kicks up a lot of dust right there in the middle, and some rocks too. And if I throw it even higher, it'll be too far from the ground to see the shockwave effect on the ground. So yeah, so that's what I've been up to. Actually, you can see one other thing that I've been fiddling with, and that is the shader on her. She's using a attempt at a physically based shader that I was fiddling with in Strumpy. That's actually probably going to be the next project I work on, is doing a proper version of this. Because I ran into some serious limitations in what Strumpy was designed to do. It turns out you can't write your own lighting functions in Strumpy. You have to go back and edit the CG file anyway, so I may as well just write it there. Anyway, so that's what I'm up to and what I plan to be up to in the coming days. I hope this was interesting to you. If anyone wants a more in-depth tutorial about the character lean or the various noise functions that I wrote, yeah, drop me a message, leave me a comment. Aside from that, I'm Ryan Gatz. Stay tuned for more game art tutorials and demos, and thanks.